and welcome to Impactful Innovation with Commercis, the show that reveals the inner workings of the technology that shapes our world. I'm David McClelland, and as we begin to reflect on the journey of innovation that we've been on over the last 8 episodes and what are the common threads that bind them, for episode 9, we look to the future, specifically the future of the network and connectivity. Our down-the-line guests today are an academic and entrepreneur who are sailing right on the innovation horizon. But first, let's meet our studio guest, sailing right on the edge of that sofa over there. It's Chief Strategic Business Development Officer at Commercis, Wael Alkhalidi. Wael, good surfing on the sofa. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having us. I'm very good, thanks.
So talk to me about what you do at Commercis, particularly as regards our conversation today around the future of the network.
Yeah, thank you. I've been with Commercis now about 6 years, and as within my role, I look for what's the future for Commercis? Where shall we look, and how can we diversify our business portfolio, but we still within our main domain, which is connectivity and technology. And I believe in the near future is all about the capacity and the resilience of connectivity. And this is where I'm looking at how can we achieve that amount of data to be transferred to our customers with different technologies in the connectivity market, such as terrestrial or non-terrestrial, or any new technology is going to be available in the near future.
So you are scanning the horizon, or rather scanning the skies, I guess, at the moment, as we're looking at satellites specifically, looking for those pockets of opportunity where there are potential innovations and areas where you can create value, where you can have an impact. Obviously, we're talking about the network today, but the network isn't just one technology.
Correct.
Capacity, you mentioned, is really important. That's what people want. They want more and more and more at less and less cost, I guess, as well.
You're absolutely right.
But other technologies also play an important part in that. AI, I'll throw that one in there and see if you can run with it.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this because it's a buzzword these days, and everyone trying to find where they can fit AI within their own domain. And I believe AI definitely is going to play a big role into the connectivity. And as the demand increases on the connectivity, there are multiple networks, terrestrial, non-terrestrial, cellular technologies like 6G is coming very soon. Then it's very difficult for a human to route and reroute the data. If any of those networks goes down, then definitely AI is going to play a big role. That's one element. The other element is people, they want to utilize the existing infrastructure to push more data through it. And there are, again, we're going to talk about this maybe in details, how they want to utilize the existing, what's available to get more capacity through.
We've always spoken about a network of networks when it comes to the internet here, but increasingly as we're talking about the different types of network infrastructure, it almost takes the network of networks onto a different realm, whereas it's not just fixed line subsea. It is, whether that it is cellular, it is non-terrestrial networks. It's a network of all of these different types of network capabilities that create the network that we use to communicate with one another on.
Correct. You're absolutely right. And this is where I want to mention, in the near future, people, they wouldn't care about how they're going to get the data. Is it through 5G, my phone? Is it connected to this tower or that tower? Is my network at home, is it connected terrestrial or non-terrestrial? What it matters is I'm getting that data, and I want that data in a huge amount and that's where our car is connected. It's not, before we used to say, okay, you are connected to the internet as maybe individuals to check your emails, but now everything is around you is connected. Then you need connectivity, and you need a huge amount of data goes through that connectivity. And on top of that, the resilience is very important. You cannot afford being down for even a few seconds these days.
You're setting up so many themes for us, so I'll stop us there but before we kind of blow everything out of the water straight away. Thank you for now. We'll come back in a moment. Now we're going to hear from the first of our down-the-line guests today. Declan Ganley has been deeply involved in shaping connectivity infrastructure around the world throughout his career. Now, with Rivada Space Networks, he's building from scratch a communications platform that seeks to solve what he sees as some fundamental vulnerabilities with existing internet infrastructures.
The state of global connectivity in my lifetime has massively improved. We've got global data networks, we have the internet, and a system that in peacetime, in normal times, works relatively well. stress testing of those systems is something that we haven't seen enough of. And the challenge ahead will be making sure that we have global data networks that can survive stresses. And we are now in more challenging times, and having networks that can survive events that may have been unpredictable in the past, but are much more predictable now. I think that's the challenge that lays ahead for the next short few years.
Well, I think this leads us on to the challenges then. And when we think about today's networks and networks of networks, what do you see as those main challenges, those main vulnerabilities?
I think, well, first of all, if you look at, and there's been a lot of this in the news, fortunately, there's been a lot of it in the news recently about the vulnerability of subsea cable infrastructure. But remember, there are approximately 500 subsea cables globally. That's it. So even if we doubled that, it would be 1,000. And these are the arteries of the internet and all data communications. And a coordinated effort to take down those 500 subsea cables, or some significant percentage of them, would be catastrophic for global communications and everything that is downstream of global data communications. Payments, just everything. I mean, the logistics, healthcare, law enforcement, defense, you name it. So we have become entirely intertwined. Our economies are intertwined and dependent upon the internet, and the internet is dependent upon 500 subsea cables, which are almost impossible to secure. The cost of patrolling those millions of kilometers of subsea cables is prohibitively high. And so having alternatives is a matter of, I think, of grave urgency. And the Outernet, which is something that I'd been working on, is something specifically designed to provide an alternative. And it's not going to carry all of the internet traffic of the world. It's not an alternative path for all of it, but at least so that you can keep the most critical data communications up and running in the case that we see a catastrophic event, whether it's man-made, natural disaster. Well, something on that scale would really have to be man-made. And the worrying thing is if you look at these 500 subsea cables, you wouldn't even need to have the resources of a state actor to take them down. Even a sophisticated non-state actor with a budget of some tens of millions of dollars could potentially pull it off.
And of course, we've already seen some fragility in subsea cable networks in instances over the last few months, couple of years or so, where those cables have been cut off. What kind of impact have you seen, even instances where we have seen these fragilities come to bear? What kind of impact have you seen them have on the nations, on the states where they have, been cut off, I suppose, from the rest of the world?
They've managed around it. I mean, they were not. There were enough alternative paths available where, in terms of the most critical communications, they were able to stay up. But if people will think, oh well, LEO, your average satellite constellation can bypass all of this. It can't, because the satellite system, every satellite constellation that you've heard of, all rely on ground gateways, ground relay stations. That is to say, even in satellite, the signal goes up to those satellites, and they may use an inter-satellite laser link to hop it from one satellite to another, but they're always looking for a ground relay station or a ground gateway to land that signal and put it onto the internet, and then it's dependent on the subsea cables like everything else is. So they will go dark in the event. Let's hypothesize for a moment and say a state actor decides that it is in their tactical and strategic interest to take down the global internet for a period of weeks or months, because they want to do something that they don't want others to be able to follow, track, see, and they want to create enough chaos internally for enemies that the enemies won't have time to focus on whatever it is that actor is doing. So I've done the numbers on this, and for about $60 million, you can take out the global subsea cable network. And you probably have quite a lot of change left over as well. And this is not a cyber attack, by the way. This is a physical act of severing cables. And we've seen how it's done. You drop an anchor, you drag it. There are many other ways to do it. But in that event, I mean, let's just imagine that it were to happen right now. So we lose all communications. All viewers are watching this. You lose all comms. Everything's gone. Your mobile phone isn't going to work. You can't send emails. You can't. TV isn't working. You're not going to be able to turn on the news and see what's going on. Your radio station might work, but it probably won't until they jerry-rig the thing to get it back to work on older technology, because so much of everything in modern radio is IP-based. So you are going to be dark. Now, how long is that going to last? I don't know. But if you have a state actor that is doing this, you can presume that they also know where the cable repair ships are, that there aren't enough of them, who crews those cable repair ships, what is going on in those crews' lives, because they will have built the database and network on that earlier. I mean, this is a personal view, and I have no insight from any government or anything else on this, but I sincerely believe that those cable attacks that we saw over the course of the last year and a half or so were trial runs. They were rehearsals. And what goes on in those situations is you see what happens. So you break the cable, who responds, who gets an email, who gets a phone call, where do they live, who are they married to, what car do they drive, what bar do they drink in? And the number of people that are skilled in subsea cable repairs, I'm not going to give it, but you'd be shocked at how small it is for something like this. So this would overwhelm the systems, and most of your all of your viewers here, frankly, it doesn't matter who they are, all of your viewers would be so focused on dealing with the consequences to their business, their own personal lives, their family, and everything else. And by the way, every family should have a plan for what happens if and when comms go down. You should all know where you're going to find each other or where you're going to be. Because the first thing that will work is old-fashioned postal services. That will work because they'll get those up and running and quickly. But I mean, and this might sound like a plot from a movie, but it's just too easy to do. And if you want to invade a place like, for example, Taiwan, and you want to distract the planet for a period of months, I mean, frankly, comms go down right now. The last thing that's going to be on your mind or anybody watching this show is going to be what's happening in Taiwan. It's not even going to feature in your thinking.
So that's a very big physical vulnerability that you've identified there. Something that you mentioned, perhaps by way of mitigation, is what you call the outernet. We have the internet, the network of networks at ground level and on subsea level. What role do you see this out? Well, first of all, what is the outernet? And then what role do you see the outernet in addressing some of the vulnerabilities as you see them?
The outernet is a laser mesh network shell deployed in 24 orbital planes in polar orbits, going from the North Pole to the South Pole, with approximately 25 satellites in each polar orbital plane, in each ring, going around the planet. And think about it this way. So each satellite, each of those 25 satellites, has got 4 lasers on it. And they link to an adjacent satellite and an adjacent plane. And that creates a mesh around the planet that's moving around like this all of the time from the North Pole to the South Pole. And unlike other LEO, and this is a low Earth orbit constellation, well, it's at 1,050 kilometers. So it's a bit higher than those that are deployed at like 400 kilometers or so. So it doesn't need as many satellites because you've got a better, higher horizon. When you're at 1,050 kilometers, you can see more of the surface of the planet. You create this mesh. So you go from the ground terminal, from the user terminal that's on your building or your vehicle or whatever it might be, up to the first outernet satellite. You stay on the outernet, so you don't get landed in a ground relay station. Each satellite is a router, and traffic gets routed to the end destination. So there's a terminal, could be on the other end of the planet, wherever it might be. You can go from terminal to terminal. So you go up in the Ka band of radio frequency, you stay on the laser mesh network, you land in the Ka band frequency to the receiving terminal, and you do not touch the internet at all. Now, if you want to feed internet stuff into this, of course you can connect to an Ethernet cable to your terminal, and Bob's your uncle. But you can have a global communications network that is completely detached and isolated from the internet. The issue with the internet is, of course, you encrypt your traffic and everything else, but you are always going through these big public exchanges. Even you have a virtual private network, it's virtual. And it's virtual by dint of a number of things, including encryption. But you're still going through the same exchanges and switches and cables and everything that everybody else is. And your stuff can be mirrored. It can be, you don't know where your data is. And what the Internet guarantees, can contractually guarantee, is data sovereignty, so that it's always yours in your possession, data residency, and data security. So you never touch the public internet. You're not on a virtual private network, you're on an actual private network. And because of the physical architecture of the system, the fact that it doesn't use fiber optic cables, that it's not using ground gateways, that is not going through the internet, the speed, lower latency, and of course, always the security advantages are far, far higher. It will not carry anything like the same capacity as the internet. But if you are an enterprise or you are a government, and there are some communications, data communications that you must have, whatever the circumstances, could be payment settlement, could be banking, could be cloud power, whatever it might be, the mission might be, if you absolutely cannot do without it, then the Internet is going to be an alternative network that you can put your most important traffic on that would survive the internet being knocked out or compromised.
So here's a question then. Who owns the Outernet? Because the internet isn't really owned by any one body. Yes, you can make arguments about centralization of power in various ways in which the internet works and is governed and so on. Who owns, who governs, who oversees the Outernet and ensures what you described there in terms of, ensuring data sovereignty and so on?
No, that's a great question. So and just to kind of add to your point, every global communications network you can think of is actually a patchwork quilt of different people's stuff stitched together. So there is no one single global communications network, which the first time I ever looked at this sort of surprised me. And I thought, of course, it's obvious, but you don't think about it. And it was the first time I had really thought about, hold on a second, this is going to be the world's first completely self-contained, truly global communications network, which isn't a patchwork quilt of other people's stuff stitched together. Who will own it? Rivada Networks will own it. But more importantly, I think to the point of your question is, who will own the data? Who will own the traffic that goes over it? And that will be the sovereign possession of whoever uses that network, because we don't get to look at what goes through it. We just provide the pipe. That's it. The data will have a full audit trail available to it. You will know where all of your data is all of the time at any given millisecond. And you will know the path it took. And if you want visibility to that, that's all going to be available to you. That's never been possible before. And the So as the world's first completely self-contained global communications network, it allows us to do things from a data sovereignty, data residency aspect that have just not physically been possible before.
And whereabouts are we on the journey to making the Outernet a reality?
We start to deploy the Outernet over the course of a number of months and then a couple of years to increase the density of the network. So every plane that you deploy, every plane being one ring around the planet, adds to your coverage, adds to the density of your network, your footprint, and we will eventually hit 20. We focus on the first shell, if you will, of 12 orbital planes, and then we add in another 12 to reach 24, and that's 12 gives us a very, very strong global network that could survive degradation. So even if you were to knock out a significant number of the satellites, you would still have a global communications capability that would survive a lot of degradation, even if you were physically knocking out satellites, which at 1,050 kilometers is a bit more of a challenge than at 400 kilometers. And with 24 orbital planes, you have more satellites and denser coverage. So you'll be able to see from the equator, you'll be able to see approximately 10 satellites from the surface of the equator if you're looking up your terminal. The further north or south that you go from the equator, the greater the density of satellites that you can see. Because they're in polar orbits, the concentration as you close in towards the poles, the densification of the number of satellites that are above the surface, the part of the surface of the planet that you're on, increases. So this is extreme. It's great if you're at the equator. It's the coverage, the further north or south you go, gets even denser and even more impressive.
So first launches, first parts of the constellation, early 2026, and then staggered thereafter. Watch this space or watch the sky for more. Declan, really interesting to hear your views. All the very, very best with the launches, and look forward to hearing a lot more about the Outernet in due course. Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to doing this again.
Thanks to Declan from Rivada Space Networks for joining us. Our Zoom-in guest today is Dr. Andrew Reeves, an associate professor at Durham University's Space Research Centre. And the focus of his expertise is around high-bandwidth communications over very long distances. I asked him to tell me more.
I research free space optical communication links with satellites. The idea here is that in the same way that we use fiber connections to our home to get really high bandwidth communications to our houses, we can also have optical links to space by sending a laser beam from the ground to a satellite and receiving a laser beam from the satellite on the ground. And we can encode data on top of the laser and have higher bandwidth connections that are more secure, and that should benefit future satellite constellations for internet everywhere in the world.
You mentioned how the fiber optics that nowadays are connecting our homes to the internet, that's similar to what you're doing, but in free space, in open air instead. Would that be similar to how my remote control, when I'm controlling my TV, works? That's a series of pulses of light, albeit going over a very short distance.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. That's exactly it. As you say, it's a bit further away. Typically using laser beams, so they're very directional, whereas the infrared LED in your remote control will be sending it kind of everywhere. The laser beams we send really point it exactly at the satellite that we're aiming for.
What are the kind of limitations that we're looking at, though? Because we already have things like radio frequency communications that are going back and forth towards satellites, and again, down here on Earth as well. What are the benefits and what are the limitations with free space optical communications?
Yeah, so radio link's pretty common for connecting satellites to each other in orbit, and also for connecting ground to the satellites. But they're limited in some ways. First of all, the bandwidth they can carry, so how many megabits, gigabits, terabits even of data you can carry is limited. And secondly, and sort of maybe less exciting, is spectrum licensing issues. You often hear about how countries and governments have to sell off spectrum. People talk about analog TV getting shut off so the government can sell off spectrum for 3G, 4G, 5G. This is all because the only way to separate different radio channels is via different frequencies. So if you want to have a new satellite constellation, a company has to buy a whole chunk of spectrum from governments. I mean, satellite communications want to be global, so governments all over the world have to coordinate to allow companies to have certain chunks of spectrum so they can operate an RF link. And if you want that RF link to be faster, maybe you want it to have many channels, so a wider spectrum for a single link. In an optical system, we send the laser beam directly to where it needs to go. So you can have loads of different beams all on the same frequency, but pointed in different directions. And so it means you don't have to care about spectrum anymore. You totally sidestep that issue. So it's really nice from a regulatory point of view as well. And finally, security. So with RF, we send the radio waves everywhere, so people can listen in. Hopefully the data is encrypted, but they still have it. Maybe they can decrypt it later with some special algorithm or just time. With optical, we try and send it just to the receiver. It's called the beam divergence, tells us how wide the beam is as it gets further away. And in optical, the beam divergence is much tighter. So first of all, we can just send the light more or less where we want it to go. So it cuts out a whole vector of attacks of people listening in and then maybe later decrypting the data. On top of that, people have developed quantum encryption techniques that provide theoretically secure data encryption. On top of optical links, you have to have a really efficient channel from A to B. But if you do, you can use quantum properties of photons to encrypt a key that's totally uncrackable, and you know immediately if someone's even listening in. And that's not possible with radio links. So you have these two ways in which the security can be enhanced a lot with optical links.
Maybe we'll come back to the quantum piece later on about potential use cases and what the future of communications like. But in terms of the challenges then of optical communications, particularly coming down from satellites in space, we're seeing an increase in low Earth orbit satellites beaming the internet directly into my back garden or to my roof. And of course, satellite television's been around for a very long time as well. What are the challenges with a similar kind of model when it comes to optical, to free space optical there?
Yeah, well, sadly, you wouldn't have an optical telescope on your roof to beam down satellite internet or TV. And the main challenge is clouds, really. If there's a cloud in the way, then the optical link is gone, unfortunately. That's not a showstopper, though, for a lot of applications. So, for instance, if you have a big satellite constellation, the optical link can be used as the gateway between the ground and space. So whilst clients, you and me, would connect via radio frequencies, the constellation itself would kind of ground itself to the terrestrial network with a couple of optical links. And because they're so high bandwidth, you only need one or two to be operational at any one time. So if you have a network of, say, 10 ground stations, it's said about 10 around Europe is required, then you can average out clouds, or the chance of clouds, and you can get to some statistically nice probability that you've always got a link available at 99.999% chance that with 10 ground stations, you'll have at least one link to the network. The other big challenge, even if we have clear skies, might look clear, but there's a lot of turbulence in the air. So the same thing that buffets around aeroplanes, and that affects light when it's passing through. Astronomers have known about this for a long time, and they put a lot of effort into compensating turbulence so that they can observe different stars and galaxies more clearly because it affects their astronomical observations. And it's something that's been coming into optical communications as well in the past 5 years or so, to use techniques to compensate for the atmosphere, which would otherwise cause big outages in the communication link, and try and create that stable link between ground and space, similar to what we'd have with radio frequencies.
And I think this then comes on to your area of research, helping to try and understand and then to mitigate this interference. What can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, in particular, I study a technique called adaptive optics. And this is where we observe that beam that we've received from a satellite, and it has some phase distortion caused by the turbulence. And that means some parts of the light have their kind of wavefront retarded a bit. And it means if you try and focus the beam, and ultimately we want it into an optical fiber, if we try and focus the beam, it turns into a big blur. And not only is it a big blur, it's constantly changing because the turbulence in the atmosphere is changing. It blows around with the wind. So it changes on millisecond timescales. So I work to create adaptive optic systems that will sense that disturbance in the wavefront of the light, very quickly compute what it was, and then compensate with the help of a deformable mirror. So this is a mirror in the beam path. It changes its shape really quickly, so that we can compensate the wavefront, hopefully have a flat wavefront, and focus into a single mode fiber, which has a tiny glass core of some microns thick. So we're trying to focus down to a really tight spot.
And this area of adaptive optics, understanding how light changes depending upon atmospheric conditions and then correcting that and trying to create as resilient a communications link as possible. That's something that, as a whole, the Durham University Space Research Centre is putting a lot of effort into, I understand.
That's right. Yeah, we have a team for some years who've been studying the atmosphere. The first step is understanding what it does to the light beam and understanding how it changes. For instance, I talked about how we might have this network of 10 ground stations around Europe. Maybe you've got only 1 or 2 free from cloud. If it has blue skies, really it should be able to operate. So we have to know what the likelihood is that the turbulence is very strong as well. So we've developed models that will predict turbulence, a bit like weather forecasting models. We'll do turbulence forecasting for any location around the world based on turbulence forecasting data. And the next step is simulating how light propagates through the air and through turbulent air to understand, okay, so we know the turbulence, how would a communication link work? And then we can gather statistics of a link. How much light do we see if we took a minute or 10 minutes or an hour? And what are fades? How long will we have outages for? And then we can work with teams who think more about the communication side to understand how they can adapt their error correction codes or their data modulation schemes to understand how best to fit on that optical channel.
It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. What do you see then as the primary applications for this type of communications technology? Where will we see it, I guess, or maybe not see it, given what we're talking about, even though it is optical? Where do you think we'll start to see this more widespread, and maybe when?
There are a few different ones. The one I've touched on already a little bit is large satellite constellations. So people might know of Starlink, which is SpaceX's big low Earth orbit satellite constellation. Amazon are launching Kuiper, which will be something similar. In Europe, there's OneWeb, which again has a smaller but still very effective low Earth orbit constellation. And these all currently operate with radio waves, at least in their ground satellite links. Starlink actually say that they do intersatellite laser links at the moment.
Uh-huh.
And it's likely that these will be enhanced with optical links from ground to space. The first step might be to use a geostationary node. So there's companies like Viasat who already have geostationary networks. They're looking at introducing optical links into their networks so that they have links from ground to space with optical. And then they have this really high bandwidth network from ground to space. And then they can offer their customers higher availabilities, higher bandwidths on their RF links from geostationary back down to Earth.
Yep.
So that could start to become available. You'd notice that through satellite companies beginning to maybe better compete with terrestrial network. Currently, satellite internet's this kind of thing you do if you're really remote, or if you are in a ship at sea, so there's no chance of terrestrial network, or an aircraft in the sky. But maybe with optical links, providing this really high bandwidth gateway from ground to space, you could start to see customers in urban locations able to, there's an option rather than just getting the local fiber network. It also means people in those remote locations will have network comparable to urban settings, so really high bandwidth internet, which could have quite a big impact on business people who want to work but not live in a city. So there's some quite exciting stuff in that regard. Other applications, again, we talked about quantum key distribution.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this because there is this, depending on who you listen to, this kind of ticking clock to the point where quantum will be able to unlock a lot of the encryption technologies that we've been using up until this point, which could pose all kinds of problems for data that we're already storing with today's safe encryption technology, data that's in flight as well, but also stuff that people have been storing up for the last few years in the hope that they might be able to decrypt it someday.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, are we ever accepting that another state might decrypt interstate communications or between governments? And if that's all being recorded, people, like you said, it's never quite clear how far away quantum computers are. But the one thing quantum computers will be good at is decrypting existing encryption algorithms. And existing encryption only relies on the fact that it's difficult to decrypt. Nothing says it's impossible, but it's just on current computer hardware, it would take hundreds of years to do it. Quantum computers should be able to do it in minutes. So it's a bit scary. Quantum key distribution is totally robust and immune to quantum computing. You can't break it. So it's a very interesting application. And whereas what I talked about before, those big satellite networks, you might have tens of these ground stations dotted around places, probably in relatively remote places. They have to be near big terrestrial networks, but probably not in cities. For quantum key distribution, if it really takes off, you might have small telescope ground stations on the top of embassies because they want to ensure secure communications between governments or in between governments. Financial institutions, banks will want to make sure everything's very secure. To the end user, it's probably more likely to rely on this things called post-quantum cryptography that use more classical techniques. So it's unlikely, again, we'll all have optical ground stations on our roofs, but it's not out of the question that most towns and cities would have some optical ground station infrastructure.
It's fascinating stuff. Andrew Reeves, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Dr. Andrew Reeves from Durham University Space Research Centre. Well, you've been listening in intently there. Really interesting conversations about this concept and, well, soon to be reality of this outer net, separate to the internet as we know it, but then also a way of getting quite a lot of data, potentially up to space, whichever infrastructure there. What do you take away from this approach to creating resilience, creating another network and creating capacity?
Yeah, it's very interesting view actually, and I totally agree with everything's been said today. And if you think about it, the two subjects, they are complementing each other. It's been mentioned by Declan and Dr. Andrew. They were mentioning about the outer internet, where they want to have a network in the space. At the same time, you need to download that data. You need a different way of communicating with the space. The radio frequencies is not good enough anymore or cannot handle that big data. Then you need the laser. That's where you see the two complementing each other. And that takes us back again to where we started this conversation, is all about the capacity of the data. There will be a huge amount of data. But the other twist on that story is some people on the ground, they are saying, okay, if there's a huge amount of data, how can we utilize the existing infrastructure to push more data through that? And that's where the research comes into the fiber optic. For example, there is a new technology called space division multiplexing, where in the same strand of fiber, they can push more data than ever before, which they believe is going to increase by 40 to 50% amount of data. The other technology is the hollow core, which basically they, instead of sending light, they want to make the core is actually hollow and air, and that reduces the resistance, and the latency will increases actually by 10 to 20%. And this been done in some labs, and Microsoft, they acquired recently one of the companies to do such a test, and it's been proven is very effective. Furthermore, that's what's happening on the ground. But if you take it to the space, you see like Rivada, what they are talking about, and some other companies, they already done it, like Starlink, and we see Amazon Kuiper they are trying to do, where they want to have inter-satellite connectivity. But how can we bring all that together? This is where it comes the question.
Yeah, so I mean, there is that term, the splinter net, isn't there, where we have little factions of networks that are disconnected from one another, which creates a bit of a problem, doesn't it? You know, when we are, whether we're purely trying to communicate from one place to another, when there are multiple different potential bits of a network of networks, that can be challenging. How do we create resiliency without increasing complexity and potentially increasing the splinterization of the networks? Because surely that's something we don't want.
Correct. At this stage, it seems there's some fragmentation, but there are lots of actually approaches from companies. they are trying to bring all that and they make it as a hybrid network. Because if we come back again to where we started, in the future, people, they just want to be connected. They don't care if that could be terrestrial or satellite. And this is where you actually come in and you try to make everything as one piece for the customer, and you provide that connectivity, and then you add the layer of resilience on top of it. Then what I would suggest now, I believe in the near future, there will be definitely data center in the space, as we believe some people talking about that. And that where it will address one of the points that you just mentioned, where that data, if there's actually non-terrestrial network, why don't we put that data there? Why do we keep it just on the ground?
Well, we've been talking throughout this series really about collocation, about bringing infrastructure to the most sensible place for it to be, not because it's where it's always been, but actually if you've got energy or if you've got a network point of presence, then why not bring the compute, why not bring the storage there, which is where we've heard this series about wind farms, about wind turbines with a mini data center in there. We've heard about teleports becoming data parks because you've got not only the communications but potentially the power, the storage, the compute all in one place. And that naturally leads us then, if we're looking at space networks here, you've got the network, obviously, that's what's being built out. You've also got the energy through solar. I'm guessing that heat isn't necessarily so much of a problem in space because it's pretty chilly up there as well. So when you start taking compute capability and storage up there as well, doesn't that create even more of a kind of fragmentation here? Or is this where the service is to ensure that everything does hook together how we want it to be? That's where they come into play.
You're absolutely right. I believe this will be the future. And if I go back to what Declan was saying, he mentioned a very good point. He said most of the non-terrestrial network, or let's say the satellites, they should come back to the ground, to the gateway. And from there, they need to be connected to the internet that we know it in order to access the data. But as you said, imagine if that goes up into the space, into the rock, into one of those satellites and stays there, and the data will be actually given back to the customer from the same way that is communicating with the satellite. However, the challenge is there's lots of advantages, as you mentioned, but there's actually some challenges. The cost of actually launching the satellite is huge, as you might know. And every kilogram, when you put it on the rocket, that costs a lot of money. This is, I believe, the most challenging part as we speak. But as the storage, as we know, the hard drives used to be a huge amount of metal piece, actually very heavy. Now it's getting smaller and smaller. Then I believe this challenge will be addressed in very near future. And as the satellite itself, it gets smaller, then they can actually put more into the rocket and they launch it. This will be very, I believe, in the next decade, we will see it is very normal, and we will talk about it. And I remember Enno mentioned in very first episode is about sometimes it's good to fragment the data where you store it, actually, for one reason or another, for the security. Then this will be a very good application for it. Some of the data might reside on the data center on the ground, some of it will be in the space, and that's where you can increase your data resilience or data recovery or whatever you want to call it on what's your approach. But I believe that cannot be done by just a human role. There must be AI to manage all that, because it's going to be a huge effort for the human to do it. Then I believe AI is going to play a big role in that. And as we see AI is evolving from generative AI to AI thinks for itself, then that will be the future as well.
Wow. AI-powered data centers in space. Wow, you've certainly taken us on a journey over the last 10 minutes or so. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your insights and your reflections back on our great chats today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Looking ahead to our next episode, and well, it's the final show of the series, and we'll be welcoming not one but two guests back onto our studio sofa to reflect on the stories that we've covered, to draw some conclusions on what the past teaches us about the future, and to look forward to what may come next. That's coming up in episode 10 of Impactful Innovation with Commercis. Until then, from Wael and me and everybody here, bye-bye.